Well, let's get to our panel right now. Joining us from London is Sean O'Grady. He is the Deputy Managing Editor for the Independent newspaper. From Manchester, Mohammed Shafiq is Chief Executive of the Ramadhan Foundation, a leading British Muslim organisation. From Paris, Jalel Harchaoui is a geopolitical researcher at the University of Paris 8. And with us in the studio, Aykan Erdemir is a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sean O'Grady, let me start with you and look at this attack that took place in London. Britain has some of the most pervasive surveillance capabilities in the world. According to the New York Times, there are very few restrictions on the collection of cell phone data or internet data in the United Kingdom. The entire country is blanketed by CCTV cameras. Yet we have these 3 attacks in the past 3 months. And I guess the question must be, can you stop these kinds of attacks? You may have the Prime Minister looking at what she calls countering terrorism and reviewing that, but how does one counter this type of terrorism?
Well, you're right. It is very, very difficult indeed. It's an evolving thing. What we found with some of the recent attacks, it's hard to generalize about all of them, but I mean, what we found with some of the recent attacks is that they are low tech. All you need is a kitchen knife and a van and a driving license, maybe not even that, to wreak havoc. And we found also that these people are very often not very well connected to so-called Islamic State or some sort of mothership. They take it upon themselves. They're often inspired. They could be doing a copycat affair. The attack we had on London Bridge was very similar to the attack a few miles away on Westminster Bridge, for example, which is a car with driving over, running people over. So that's why it's so difficult, because somebody who's not known to the police necessarily, or not very well known, or rather a minor figure, maybe a bit of a talkative sort of activist type, but who's never been in trouble for violence or anything like that, they can take it upon themselves in a short time to go out and commit a crime relatively easily, to commit murder, to commit mayhem, to commit an act of terror. And that's one reason why it's very hard to prevent. That's in the short run. Then we've got a longer run problem about why these people do these things, what their motivation is, and how you can act on these sort of evil death cults that get into people's minds like a worm and take them over and effectively and lead them into these sort of paths, which is a relatively new thing in the last decade or two around the world. It's not just Britain. You know, it's obviously it happened in America on 9/11 and other times. It's happened in France, in Morocco, in Turkey, in Germany. Many countries have been affected by this all around the world, even in Asia. So the question is, how did this come about? What are the geopolitical reasons for it? Okay. What are the reasons that go on with what's going on in mosques or in Muslim communities and so forth, or in some of them at any rate? But it is a very tiny number of people involved in these things. But as we know from terrorism throughout history, in every part of the world and every type of terrorism, it takes very, very few people to make a huge impact and to send people a lot of people thinking in the wrong directions.
Okay, let me go to Mohammed Shafiq in Manchester. And Mohammed, the British police today identified 2 of the 3 attackers from that attack in London. Now, you had an encounter with one of them, didn't you?
Yes, Khurram Butt, just after the brutal murder of a British soldier in May 2013, outside Parliament, I was carrying out various TV interviews, and I confronted a cheerleader, the godfather, if you like, of this extremist group, Al-Muhajirun, called Anjam Chowdhury. I wanted to confront him about his support for terrorism. And at that stage, Khurram Butt shouted out Murtad. And for those people who know what the term means in Arabic, it's a term called traitor, which is being used by ISIS and other extremist groups to declare somebody as a non-Muslim and therefore a legitimate target to be killed or to cause harm. He's part of a network of people from the Al-Muhajirun group, which has been banned by the British government, but still has operated over these past few years in open season. They've been able to fly the ISIS flag, to go outside mosques and in places where there are strong Arab community in Edgware Road, for example, in London, and shout their slogans, glorify terrorism and glorify the actions of these terrorists. You know, 3 weeks on from the Manchester attack here in my home city, and now in London, we faced a real threat of what people in Iraq, in Syria, in Pakistan, in other parts of the world face on a daily basis. There's an evil, twisted ideology of violence that we've got to confront. And it's no longer good enough for us in the Muslim community to say, this has got nothing to do with us, it's not part of our faith, when these people misquote from Islamic teachings, and that's what we've got to confront.
All right, let me bring in Jalel in Paris. And Jalel, of course, France has been the target of terrorists as well. You had the suicide bombings in November of 2015, the attacks in Paris, and of course that truck attack that took a lot of lives in Nice. How has France responded to the attacks?
Well, I must say that what strikes me the most is just the sheer amount of confusion. There's, especially with the latest events from Britain. I think people are, I don't, you know, when you look at the debates in political circles, you know, politicians, political commentators, you know, it barely makes sense. I think there's a sense of powerlessness, which I wanted to specify. But and also a lot of people are asking, when did this start? You know, is this brand new? And I think a lot of people forget that terror has always been, I mean, it has been around in Europe, Germany, Britain, France for the last several decades. And I think that's another feature that I've noticed is like a very striking lack of memory. You know, we were talking about Manchester. The person who committed that atrocity in Manchester is a British Libyan. I work a lot on Libya, and it's interesting to see that tragedy from that angle. France was really glorifying this war effort in 2011, and this kid, and that person was a teenager at the time, participated in what was presented as a very romantic, glorious revolution. So you must kind of put yourself in the shoes of a very impressionable young creature like this teenager at the time, and the narrative kind of changes a lot. And I think we need to have more historical background and more knowledge, which I don't see around me right now in France.
Aykan, we've had attacks in several cities in Europe: Paris, London, Brussels, Berlin. There was an attack there as well. Question is, why are terrorists targeting Europe? I mean, what is their motive? What do they want to achieve?
We have to remember that they have also targeted Turkey, a Muslim majority country. They have targeted Thailand in Asia. So it is a global phenomenon. We're talking about a global jihadi wave. Sure, Europe seems to be at the core of this set of attacks. Europe as an idea, Europe as an ideal, I think is one of the targets of this hateful, vengeful ideology. And I think we have to take the ideas seriously, because there are some analysts who would argue that this has nothing to do with religion. This is a nihilistic youth just using Islam as pretext. On the other hand, we can argue that no, ideas do matter, meaning the hateful preaching, the anti-Christian, anti-Western, anti-Semitic, misogynist, homophobic teachings do matter. And this is what I also tend to think. That is, we're talking about a transnational rise in hate preaching, hate speech, that is also exacerbated by the social media. And when we take a look at what's happening in Germany, in France, in the UK, we're seeing that on the one hand, we have a transnational global phenomenon, and on the other hand, we have what is mostly nation-state attempts to resist that. I think the key issue is, how can we engage this jihadi violence?
It's a classic asymmetric war, isn't it?
It is very asymmetric.